This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 805 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting to the mailbag questions this week, remember to check out everything going on with Late Round Fantasy Football. You can see all of the offerings over on lateround.com. Okay, mailbag time. Let's do this. The first question this week is from David from Patreon. It says, with the news of Akers being traded to the Vikings, how do you see that backfield shaking out? So I feel like I talked a ton about Alexander Mattison all summer. He really profiled to be an average running back. And I sent a newsletter out showing historical comps for Mattison. Essentially players who had not done a lot for the first handful of years of their career, who then got a decent sized workload. And there were really no true hits over the last decade among those players. The sample size wasn't huge, but it was still alarming. It was like the Mike Davises of the world. The upside with Mattison this year was strictly volume-based. And when you draft a running back who's strictly a volume-based play, when the talent doesn't exactly line up, it makes that pick a very volatile pick. Now, I could see the upside with Mattison, of course. If he saw that volume, he was going to be fine. Maybe not a league winner, but fine. And you could have made a similar argument about a lot of the running backs in the range that he was drafted in, which is the running back dead zone. But I said it on a mailbag episode in August. He really did look like the quintessential dead zone back. He didn't have the talent backbone of like a Kenneth Walker. Now, of course, people are going to say this is all hindsight based. But I think anyone who listened to this show, who read my stuff this summer, you knew that there were question marks with Alexander Mattison as a player. I'm prefacing with all of that because I think this Akers news matters for Alexander Mattison. That lack of talent profile, that makes him more vulnerable to losing work with news like this. It could have been Rachaad White. It could have been Jerome Ford. Players who we really don't know if they're above average or not. It just happened to go down with Mattison. Here's the thing though, I actually don't think that it's some lock that Cam Akers is a better player than Mattison. Metrics like rushing yards over expected per carry, they favor Akers. But some, like success rate, favor Mattison. Mattison actually had a higher percentage of rushes go for 10 plus and 20 plus yards last year than Cam Akers. Mattison had the better PFF grade. And it's not as though Akers has been this crazy target earner throughout his career. He averaged a 4.6% target share per game rate in his best season. That's actually pretty bad. Both players in my eyes are average running backs. I liked Akers more as a prospect. I think Akers is more of an athlete, which could separate him. But I also think that Achilles injury really derailed a lot of that momentum. Now, I know the Vikings didn't spend anything to really get Akers here. It was almost a completely worthless trade. But I do think the trade signals that they're not totally content with Alexander Mattison, which they shouldn't be. He hasn't been good to start the season. And coaching is going to drive the value of these players in fantasy football, as is the case with all backfields. But with this one in particular, the talent involved is not as obvious. This isn't Breece Hall versus Dalvin Cook, where we can confidently say Breece Hall is going to get more work as the season goes on because he's so much better than every other running back in that backfield. So I think that you could argue from that perspective that under this current regime, this coaching staff, which by the way, Kevin O'Connell has a history with Akers. But with this coaching staff, Mattison's arrow is pointing downward more than Cam Akers, just given the actions that they've taken, even though Akers was just pushed aside from his old team. Which I guess means hypothetically, Akers would have more upside in this offense to really take it over and to see the volume that drafters were trying to get in drafts this year with Alexander Mattison. But look, if I'm being totally honest, which I'm always honest on this show, unless I can buy very low on either of these players or get one of them off waivers or something, I'm not running to the Akers and Mattison managers right now asking for a deal. I see this as a potential split backfield between two pretty average running backs. This is not an ambiguous backfield that I'm desperate to buy into because I'm just not that big of a believer in the talent. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Chuck Easy. It says, "Hello, JJ. Can you explain the rant you were going to give for same position trades? Example, Drake London for Jahan Dotson. Thanks." So I mentioned to members of the Late Round Fantasy Football Discord earlier this week that I was potentially going to rant about same position trades on the weekly live stream that I do on Tuesday nights. Because I keep getting same position trade questions. Same position trades are very annoying to me. And this is more redraft focused. In Dynasty, it's different when you consider where certain teams are and how competitive they are. But I hate same position for same position deals, like a swap of wide receivers or a swap of running backs, because there's a guaranteed loser in that deal. One team is not going to win because one player is going to outscore the other. At least when you trade a running back for a wideout, you're hypothetically attempting to help both teams. Both teams have a shot to get better, which is the entire point of a trade in the first place. Now, honestly, I think a lot of the frustration with those deals is that they just completely lack creativity. It's similar to when people ask me, who should I trade this player for? The answer isn't some specific player. The answer is looking at your opponent's rosters and seeing how you can make those rosters better. Now, I know that I'm passionate on this show, and I sound super, super passionate right now. I don't want to come across like this is some super strong stance. There are times and instances where it's fine to do one of those positional swaps. A lot of my thinking around why I don't prefer them, though, is because, like I just said, number one, both teams do not have a chance to get better in most cases. And I stress in most cases. There are some cases where it does make sense where it's fine. But then number two, just spend a little bit more time crafting up a better trade. Give your trade partner something that they need that you have a surplus of. That's how you're going to get deals done more consistently. This next question is also from Patreon. It's from Mark. It says, "Hey JJ, what is your rest of season outlook of the currently underperforming tight ends, specifically Kyle Pitts and David Njoku? Are there any underlying metrics that should give us confidence?" So what I've realized is that I don't think fantasy managers always have the best holistic view of positions. They just kind of have this tunnel vision look at how their team is performing without realizing that other teams are having very similar struggles. And it's always evident at tight end. Look, David Njoku, Kyle Pitts, they haven't been great. I'm not trying to sell this a different way. They have not been good. But don't forget to put their seasons into context. After week 2, David Njoku is actually 9th in receiving yards at tight end because the position is so bad. But you can look at Fantasy Life's utilization report and see for yourself. You can see some underlying metrics that matter. I keep mentioning Fantasy Life because they have free tools that you can access. This isn't something that only fantasy analysts can see. You can see it too. But check out their utilization report and look at tight end route participation. Njoku is 12th in the league right now in route participation. Kyle Pitts is 2nd. Those are good signs that they're still involved in that offense or still being used as receiving weapons. Now, Njoku hasn't seen a very strong target share, but it's still early enough where I'm not overly concerned. Pitts' target share is still a healthy 17.4%, and I think that number is naturally going to increase. Now, I don't think either guy is a buy, but there are at least some underlying metrics that should make us think that they're going to be usable moving forward. But they're not locked in no matter what starters right now. This next question is from @_John Marcus on Twitter. It says, Pat Freiermuth only has 2 catches through 2 weeks. How do you know when to move off a slow starter to pick up potential breakouts in Musgrave, Laporta, Kincaid, etc.? So this plays into the last question a bit. How do you know when it's time to move on? Since we have a backbone of someone like Freiermuth being good in the past at a position that's not very easy to find production, I don't think it's smart to get rid of him after just 2 games. That's especially true when those 2 games were against very good fronts in San Francisco and Cleveland. The Steelers' offense has been putrid, but I do think we need to see how this team performs in a more favorable environment. So let's not give up on Freiermuth just yet simply because of that. But I also think rostering more than one tight end is totally fine. Now, obviously, league sizes and such is going to dictate whether or not you can do that. But I have plenty of teams that feature more than one tight end because I want to throw darts and increase my probability of finding one of the late round guys who can actually become an every week starter. Every player is going to be different, but after 2 weeks, I don't think giving up on Freiermuth makes a whole lot of sense when you put everything into context. even if his underlying metrics also aren't that great. This next question is from Jake. It says, what impact, if any, do you think Kareem Hunt's signing will have on Jerome Ford? So you guys know that I try to think about range of outcomes. I fully recognize that there's a world out there where Kareem Hunt ends up being the 1A in this Browns backfield. But I don't think that's the likely scenario at all. And I'm surprised there are takes out there believing in it. The Browns quite literally chose Jerome Ford over Kareem Hunt this summer. They decided to let Hunt go. And when everyone was just waiting for them to add more depth at running back, they stuck with Jerome Ford. Their actions tell me, at least, that they really like him as a player. And then Kevin Stefanski's come out and he said that Ford is the starter. Every backfield is essentially a committee at this point. The majority of them are. Ford's not going to see all of the work in the Browns backfield, but I fully expect him to see the most work. My biggest problem with Ford right now is the Browns' upcoming schedule. They get a pass funnel defense this week against Tennessee, so that matchup's not great there. And then it's Baltimore and San Francisco. So it might not be the easiest route to production over the next few weeks. But I do expect him to be the back out of that backfield that you want in fantasy football. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Carter. It says, hi, JJ, love all your stuff. I drafted Jerome Ford because you had him as a dart throw, and I'm enjoying not having to blow all of my free agent budget on him. Thanks. My question is around Quentin Johnston. I know rookies tend to do much better as the season goes on, so are you trying to keep stashing him and hoping, or is it time to move on? Thanks. A player like Quentin Johnston, rostering him depends entirely on your team and your league. I know it's an annoying answer, but it's a true answer. If you have a league with short benches, and if you need production right away, you might have to drop Johnston for a player like Josh Reynolds. That's just the reality. If you're in a league where benches are deeper, then it's easier to just wait for something to happen. But Johnston's been dropping down my rest of season rankings each week. He was a really volatile prospect. I talked about that a lot during draft season. T. Higgins was a comp that my models spit out for him, but so was Brashad Perriman. Like, if you wanted the guy who had the highest chance to bust in round one, so among Zay Flowers, JSN, and Jordan Addison, it was Johnston. He had a great ceiling, though, too. It just came down to your personal risk tolerance. Now, I was curious about something this week related to this. How predictive is week 1 and 2 production for a rookie wide receiver? Not in terms of how well they do in their careers, but just rest of season. And it turns out it's pretty predictive. I looked at all rookie wideouts since 2011 who played in week 1 and week 2. I then looked at their average points per game during those 2 weeks. I simply compared that number to how well that player performed after week 2 and through the rest of the season in PPR points per game. So week 1 and week 2 points per game versus week 3 through the end of the season points per game. The correlation between those two numbers, the R squared was 0.41, which is pretty strong when we're talking about fantasy football and football in general. So far, Johnston's averaged 2.3 PPR points per game. No wideout since 2011 has averaged more than 13 PPR points per game from week 3 onward, who scored fewer than 3 PPR points per game in weeks 1 and 2. Most of the big outputs from week 3 onward came from players who at least did something during the first 2 weeks of the season. Even Amon-Ra St. Brown, who had that monster rookie season, that monster stretch. He was at 4.6 PPR points per game across his first 2 games. Of course, this is looking at week 3 onward. There are pockets where players can produce, especially at the end of the year. But this is just to say, don't ignore this slow start from Quentin Johnston. It is somewhat predictive. So I can understand needing to drop him right now. I'd try to hold on because it's hard to give up on rookies after just 2 weeks. But I know that it's not always easy if you need immediate production. That's just how it goes sometimes. The last question this week is from @JH7123 on Twitter. It says, with the Patriots seeming to need to pass more due to a tough schedule, does it look like Hunter Henry is a top 10 tight end for the rest of the season potentially? So I think you sort of answered this one for yourself. The Patriots are passing more due to a tough schedule, period. I would be shocked if this pass rate continues. The only team that's run more plays this year offensively while trailing is Houston. And it's by a huge margin. Houston's run 144 plays while trailing. New England's at 141. And then the next teams on that list, it's the Giants and Bears. And this is pre-Thursday Night Football. Those two teams are at 112. This is why looking at peripheral numbers, this is why it matters. I don't think Henry's going to be a bad fantasy asset rest of season, but he's currently 18th in tight end target share, and he's on the fringe in the top 10 in route participation. He's just scored twice to start the year, so everyone's really into him because he's actually producing. His target share, though, has been in a pass-heavy offense, which is why his totals have been decent at 6 and 7 targets. But this is why we look at target share. People always ask me about this. This is the perfect example. The Patriots, for instance, they get the Jets this weekend. What are the odds that New England is trailing consistently by a lot of points in that game? That they go with a pass-heavy approach against the Jets? Because to start the year, like I said, they've been trailing more than almost any other team. As a result, they're first in air yards, but they're 9th in air yards per attempt because they're 3rd in total dropbacks. They're 4th in pass rate. When you look at target share and you use that as a predictor, you're able to be more reactive with your projections. Hunter Henry's averaged 6.5 targets per game. But if he maintains that target share and the Patriots throw the ball less, then that total is going to drop. Again, I'm not saying Henry's a bad player to have rostered. I just think this New England offense needs more context right now. He's totally fine to have rostered, and his touchdown upside could keep him in the top 10. It could. I've just seen way too many people crowning him prematurely. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. And also remember to follow the Late Round Fantasy Football account on Instagram, which can be found there @LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. I'll talk to you next week.